Hello, this is Exquisite Timepieces in Naples, Florida, and today we're looking at the Grand Seiko SBGA211 Snowflake. But first, a quick message about us. We are a brick-and-mortar authorized dealer of more than 50 of the world's finest watch brands, and we've been in business here in Naples, Florida for over 20 years. We also buy, sell, and trade on pre-owned watches, and we offer the highest prices on the watches that we buy. So check out our website, exquisitettimepieces.com, or give us a call at 239-227-2932, or of course visit our showroom in Naples, Florida anytime. And now, let's check out the watch. Today, we're revisiting the Grand Seiko SBGA211, or the Snowflake as it's known. It's a watch that's appeared here on the channel in the past, and it's one that I think deserves another look. It is one of the most popular and best-selling watches in the Grand Seiko catalog, and it's a watch collector's fan favorite. So it's definitely time to go back and take a closer look at this fantastic watch. First, the features, specifications, and price. The Snowflake has a manufacturer's suggested retail price of $5,800. The watch's dimensions come in at 41 millimeters in case diameter with a thickness of 12.5 millimeters, and it has a wingspan of 48.5 from lug tip to lug tip. Finally, the length between the lugs where the bracelet attaches to the case is 20 millimeters in width. The remaining features and specifications include construction from high-intensity titanium on both the watch case and the bracelet, a dual-curved sapphire crystal with anti-reflective coating on the underside, a signed and screw-down crown, 100 meters of water resistance, and of course the watch is powered by the 9R65 spring drive movement. And while all of that makes for an impressive looking watch on paper, there are two real hallmarks that have lifted the Grand Seiko SBGA211 to legendary status amongst watch fans: the white snowflake dial and the exceptional fit and finish. The watch case and the bracelet feature a mix of both brushed and polished surfaces and the mirrored Zaratsu polishing as seen on the bezel, the chamfered edges of the case, and on the bracelet links is something that really grabs your attention. The process of Zaratsu polishing is a skill that takes craftsmen at Grand Seiko years to master before being permitted to do final finishing on watch cases meant to be sold. Interestingly, the history of this finishing process began back in the 1960s. A designer for Grand Seiko was given the task of giving the watches and the brand an identity that would stand out from the competition. This designer spent time analyzing consumer reaction to watches from around the world, and they concluded that for the Grand Seiko product to stand out amongst the pack, it should attract the eye and it needed more brilliance. His design concept was to create watches with sharp angles and mirrored, distortion-free polished surfaces that would sparkle with quality. Two watches were released in 1967 and 68 respectively, which would demonstrate this new style and aesthetic. They were the 44GS and the 61GS, and they're both acknowledged by many as Grand Seiko masterpieces today. And while the sharp angles and the mirror polished surfaces of the case do grab your attention, some would say that they're eclipsed by the real main event of this timepiece, that being the Snowflake dial. It's a dial texture that Seiko says resembles freshly fallen powder snow, inspired by the Japanese mountain views just beyond the design team's studio. To me, it resembles a fine parchment paper, but regardless of the imagery that captures your mind's eye, when you look at the dial, it's clear why so many fans of the brand love this watch. The dial's applied markers and the handset that sits above are sharp and crisp, with facets and bevels that are precise, and they feature mirrored polishing that is every bit the equal to the finishing on the case. And as if to remind you of the chilled, snow-covered mountains on which this design draws its inspiration, the final touch is a cool blue central seconds hand, giving the watch its only splash of color. The dial, while artistic in its implementation, also offers some practical applications as well, including a framed date window at the 3 o'clock position and a power reserve indicator, letting the wearer keep apprised of how much of that 72-hour power reserve is still stored in the spring drive movement. The spring drive 9R65 movement powering this watch is an innovation that's decades in the making. It's a movement that was first conceived in the late 1970s and not released commercially until 1999 in the Japanese market limited edition manual wind watches from both Creator and Seiko. The first non-limited edition models were released in Japan in 2002, and it wasn't until 2005 that the first automatic spring drive watches were released, which also marks the introduction of the movement outside of the Japanese domestic market. The 9R65 caliber movement found in this watch is one of the latest and the most sophisticated versions of the spring drive movement. It offers 72 hours of power reserve, has a Grand Seiko signed and decorated automatic self-winding rotor, and it boasts an accuracy of plus or minus 15 seconds per month on average. The nicely decorated movement is viewable from the sapphire crystal display case back, and because of how the spring drive regulates timekeeping, you're presented with that perfectly smooth, sweeping seconds hand motion that you just won't find on a typical mechanical or automatic timepiece. Now, if you've only recently found an interest in watches or the Grand Seiko brand, something that you might not know is that the SBGA211 Snowflake is not the first Grand Seiko Snowflake model. In 2017, Seiko decided to change its branding and its image and further separate its higher-tier luxury watches from the more affordable Seiko line of watches. Prior to that, there existed a Grand Seiko Snowflake with the reference number SBGA211, and while the watch is functionally the same, it had a slightly different dial, as did all Grand Seiko watches before the rebranding. It used to be that at the top of the dial above the central hand stack, the word Seiko appeared in a bold applied marker, much like the current model's GS emblem. Back then, the Grand Seiko branding sat below the hand stack at the 6 o'clock side of the dial. Those 011 pre-2017 model watches, they do come up for sale pre-owned from time to time, and some fans of the brand prefer that older classic Seiko-styled logo. Regardless of which logo style you prefer, the watches are functionally no different from one another, but it's an interesting historical footnote in the legacy of the Grand Seiko Snowflake and of the brand. Moving on to the bracelet, the SBGA211 rides on a 20mm wide titanium constructed bracelet that features a mix of polished and brushed surfaces, and it terminates into a dual triggered blank clasp. The signed clasp is minimalist in design and low profile, but nicely decorated with the GS logo. The links are retained using a classic pin and collar system, which can be a bit more challenging to resize than watches with screwed links, but it's no less secure. On my wrist size of 6 3/4 inches in circumference, the watch wears comfortably and the lug-to-lug length doesn't test the outer limits of my wrist. However, the watch does present more similarly in size to something like a modern sports watch than it does a classic dress piece. A larger wrist presence is fairly typical for white dialed watches, as these types of dials just seem to stand out more and they have a bolder and more substantial look about them. Still, it is a size that I think most average-sized wrists should get along with pretty well. The Grand Seiko Snowflake reference SBGA211 is a transcendent watch. It spans the gamut from sports to dress watch genres. Its fit, finish, quality, and value are evident, and it's easy to see why it's a fan favorite amongst collectors and fans of the Grand Seiko brand. If you haven't had a chance to try one on and see it in person, head down to the shop and give it a look. I think you'll be impressed. Thanks for watching. If you liked this watch, please visit the ExquisiteTimepieces.com website to view it, along with our entire collection of both new and pre-owned watches. Or of course, you can visit our showroom right here in Naples, Florida, anytime.